Hello. I am pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Leslie Goddard. Leslie is an actress and a historian who's been portraying famous women in history for more than 15 years. In addition to both a bachelor's and a master's degree in theater, she has a Ph.D. from Northwestern University and currently works full-time as a historical interpreter and public speaker. Today, she's going to take us back to 1904. Miss Lizzie Borden has agreed to join us from her home in Fall River, Massachusetts. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Miss Borden.
Good afternoon. Can you hear them? The children outside? They're playing skip rope. They are out there every day, and they know that I can hear them, so they always chant the same thing. You know. Lizzie Borden took an axe, gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. May I please note that a jury of 12 determined I did not kill them. And whoever did kill them used a hatchet, not an axe, a very different tool. The woman who died was not my mother. She was my stepmother. She died of 18 blows to the head, not 40. My father died of 10, far short of 41. So the whole chant is wrong, everything in it. They do not even have my name right. Well, I was Lizzie Borden then, but it has been some time now that I have been known as Lizbeth. Lizbeth Borden. But I have a plan. I've invited some local children in tonight to have afternoon tea with their mothers, of course, so they can see I am not a monster. Would you really expect to find a monster living in a comfortable home like this? I love this house. My sister Emma and I, we bought this house together, not long after the trial ended. Number 7 French Street. Doesn't that sound nice? It has a big lawn outside, all the latest conveniences inside. We have electricity. Imagine that. On the lower level, we have a water closet, and upstairs, a full lavatory. On the top floor, we have 4 servants' bedrooms. We have a housekeeper, 2 maids, and a coachman. Perhaps someday it will be a chauffeur. I think I would enjoy having one of those new motor cars. I even have a name for this house. I call it Maplecroft. Isn't that nice? I'm thinking about having that carved onto the front steps. Well, it's not a mansion, far from it. It's not even much larger than our old house. But could anyone really expect us to live in a house that the newspapers had long before declared a house of horrors? Well, they should be arriving soon, if the newspapers have not scared them off. Today is August 4th, and you know what that means. It is time for the Fall River Globe's annual anniversary edition. Front and center every August 4th. Here it is. There occurred 5 years ago today one of the most shocking, unnatural crimes that ever befouled the pages of history. And the demon that sent 2 souls into eternity has never yet been punished. Perhaps the good people of Fall River may be daily meeting him or her in store or railroad train. Well, yes, perhaps. Obviously, they believe it is me. As far as Fall River is concerned, I am an outcast, a pariah. I could very well be the daughter of Ishmael, the outcast. Even friends who stood by me during the trial have drifted away. When I go out, If I am walking down the street and I happen to pass someone, they will look right through me, as if I were not even there. Or if our eyes should happen to meet, they will look at me and then away, and then at me and then away. And I can almost hear them thinking, did she, or didn't she? They know that a jury declared I was not guilty. But still, when I am walking in a park or examining fabric in a store, I can almost hear them thinking, did she or didn't she? Really? Is that the best we can do in this advanced year of 1897? Would it really kill them to say, good morning, Lizbeth? Has anyone ever died from that? I try to behave with the utmost propriety. I have studied, all the best etiquette books. Mrs. John Sherwood is my guide. I know the proper way to make tea. The key is you add the milk after you pour the tea, so you can judge the amount by the color of the tea. And you always fold the sugar and milk in. You don't stir it vigorously. But Mrs. John Sherwood says nothing about proper behavior for an acquitted murderess. Perhaps before another year rolls around, conscience will cause the criminal who shocked the world with one of the most ghastly, cruel, and brutal double murders to deliver himself or herself into the hands of the avenging law. Who can tell? Who indeed? When the moving vans pulled up in front of our old house, not long after that trial ended, many took it as a sign that Emma and I would be leaving Fall River. Well, they were mistaken. All these people who were so sure the minute the trial ended, I would flee in guilt. I don't know what possesses people. I always intended to stay here. I never had any other thought in mind. I shall get a dog, perhaps 2 of them. Let them sleep on cushions right on my bed. I have such an affinity for animals. Animals never judge you. We had lots of animals on my father's farm. He owned 2 farms at one point. Did you know that? We used to get fresh eggs delivered every day from one of them. I spent every summer at one of his farms. I really was a farm girl at heart. Did you know that? Do you know anything about me, the real me, before her? Speaking of eggs, perhaps I could show the children the egg trick. This was one of the very few bright spots in the entire time I was imprisoned. We were talking one afternoon, just me and the prison matron, Mrs. Reagan, and she suddenly said to me, I'll tell you one thing you can't do, Miss Borden. Really, I said. What is that? Break an egg, Miss Borden. Break an egg? Yes. Well, I know how to break an egg. Not the way I would tell you to break it. Well, what way is that? And she showed me how to hold it like this between the thumb and the forefinger. So that afternoon, someone fetched an egg for me. My sister Emma was sitting right next to me. Move away, Emma. When I break this egg, it will destroy your dress. So I picked up the egg and I held it just as she showed me. And no matter how hard I pushed, I could not break it. First thing I ever tried to do that I never could. First thing. Well, it is a hot day, isn't it? I should have worn a cotton dress today. Do you know that Fall River produces more cotton than any other city in this country? It's true. Spindle City, they call this town. Of course, they ought to call it waterfall city. Fall River owes its prosperity to its waterfalls. The falls of the Quikashon River. The river flows right through the city. You just did not see them when you came here today because the factories and mills are built right atop the waterfalls. Free power for all those factories that have sprung up in this city since I was born back in 1860. I've lived in Fall River all my life, as my father did before me and his father before him. My grandfather was he was a fish peddler. He made enough to get by, but he was never wealthy. My father, he was the one with a real talent for making money. You would not know it to look at him, but at the time of his death, my father was worth close to $500,000. Son of a fish peddler. He started as a cabinet maker and an undertaker, rose to become president of 2 banks, on the board of directors of 2 local mills. He owned not only the farms, but a large building downtown and many other real estate properties around town. Well, he was not the richest man in town, far from it. We never lived up here on the hill, not in his lifetime. We lived downtown on 2nd Street, sturdy frame house, plenty good enough, he said, for a frugal New Englander. Emma and I would have preferred to live up here. We used to say to him, "But Father, wouldn't you prefer to live up on the hill? Houses up there have larger rooms, gas lighting even." "What do we need with gas lighting?" he would say. "Kerosene's good enough for us, cheaper and safer." My father was close with his money. Well, it was not the safest neighborhood. Our house and barn were broken into 3 times in the months leading up to the event. Once, a thief broke into our house in the daytime, broke into Father's desk and made off with $80 in cash and Mrs. Borden's gold watch and some streetcar tickets. In the daytime, and no one saw a thing. And the following spring, our barn was broken into twice. There was not even anything in there. We did not keep a carriage or a horse. All we had in there was a flock of pigeons. And not long after that, I went into the barn to find my father killing all of them. "Father, what are you doing?" I said. "Yes, I suppose this would deter future burglars, but what are we to do with all this meat? Far more than we could ever eat." I do not mean to imply that my father was always stingy. He could be generous. Do you know what he gave me for my 30th birthday? He gave me an 11-week trip to Europe so I could go along with some other girls from Fall River. We visited England and Scotland and France and Italy. That is where I got these photographs. I might show them to the children today. Dear Father, we visited this cathedral today and it was dazzling. I am bringing you home pictures of all the great cathedrals that we are seeing. Oh, and when we were in Paris, we visited the theater. In Paris, we saw a performance by the great Sarah Bernhardt, La Grande Bernhardt. Ah, she was magnifique. After being in Europe, it was hard to come back to Fall River. It was back to the usual routine, the local Christian Endeavor Society, the Ladies' Fruit and Flower Society, teaching Sunday school. You know, Fall River has a very large population of Portuguese and Chinese immigrants, and they need good Christian education. So I was among those who volunteered to help teach them. Just simple classes, things like, now, children, today we are learning the 10 Commandments. Who can tell me one of them? Yes, thou shalt not kill. What else? Yes, honor thy father and mother. And what else? That's right, thou shalt not lie. Now, you may be wondering, why do I have a picture of my father and not my stepmother? Well, we were not close. We were cordial, but not close. Mrs. Borden was bland. Well, I never was a daughter to her, not really, or to my own mother. My own mother died before I was 3. My sister Emma, who is 9 years older than me, she was the closest I ever had to a mother. Emma told me that when our mother was on her deathbed, she gathered Emma close to her and she said, now promise, Emma, promise me that you will look after baby Lizzy. And Emma told me she promised, and she has never wavered from that promise. When I wanted mothering, I went to Emma. Besides, Mrs. Borden could be a mean old thing. Do you know what she talked our father into doing? Into giving her half-sister a house. A house! Well, I told him that what he did for her people, he might just as well do for his own flesh and blood. Things were really never the same after that. After that, Emma and I never called her mother. She was Mrs. Borden from then on. We spent most of our time upstairs in our own rooms after that. But we would come down for meals, but even then, we would usually wait until they were finished eating. I know perhaps it was a bit rude to do, but my father could be much ruder. I worried sometimes that something might happen to my father. He could be so unpleasant to people. I remember one night there was a knock on our front door. I was looking down through the banister on the staircase, and I saw Father come and unlock the front door. I could not see who it was, but I could hear their conversation. And I heard the man who entered say to him, I'd like to have that place. I'd like to rent that store from you. And Father said to him, no, I am not willing that your business go in there. And the man said, with your reputation for liking money, I thought you'd be willing to let anyone go in there. Father angrily denied it. You are mistaken, sir, and ordered him out of the house. No, I did not see who it was, but he was angry. Oh, he was angry. Father was even rude to our family doctor the night before the event. We had all been sick that week. I knew it was because we had been eating the same swordfish for several days. It is very dangerous to eat the same fish day after day in the heat of summertime. So we had all been sick. Mrs. Borden thought it was the milk. Perhaps it had been poisoned, or maybe the bakery bread had been poisoned. But she went to see our neighbor, Dr. Bowen, to see if she was all right. So that evening, that Wednesday evening, Dr. Bowen showed up at our house. Father ordered him to leave. What are you doing here? Get out. I am not paying for this visit. Oh, I was embarrassed, mortified, really. I told my friend Alice Russell that night that I felt as if I should sleep with one eye open, for fear that someone would burn the house down right over our heads. Well, perhaps I should have brought in pears for the children. I bet the pears are ripe by now. I used to love pears, but pears remind me of that day. All right, I know this is what you want me to discuss. All right, we can go back. August 4th, 1892. I cannot tell it in order, for it is very disjointed in my mind, but I do remember that all of us had some little errands to do that morning. My father went downtown to check on his businesses. Our servant, Bridget Sullivan, Emma and I always called her by the nickname Maggie. Maggie was set to work washing every window in the house. She was washing them inside and outside. Emma was out of town visiting friends. And Mrs. Borden, I believe Mrs. Borden had a note to visit some friends of hers who were sick, perhaps. I know at one point she went upstairs. My uncle, John Morse, had arrived the night before, and Mrs. Borden felt she had to tidy up the guest room, so she did that. I had some handkerchiefs that needed ironing, so I set up the little ironing board on the table in the dining room, and then I went and I put the flat irons on our kitchen range to heat them up. The house was quiet for a minute. And I remember I heard Father coming home at about 10:45. I know that because the locks, and there were 3 of them on our front door, would not open for him. Maggie had to come running in, and she cursed as she tried to open them. He came in and locked the front door locks again. Would you like to take a nice nap, Father? I can close the blinds for you. I helped my father take off his overcoat. I watched him fold it into a blanket, and then he stretched out on the small sofa in our sitting room and went to take a nap. I closed the door to the sitting room, and I went back into the kitchen. The flat irons were still not hot. I do not know what it was that caused me to think of my fishing lines at exactly that moment. I had not used them in years, but some friends were organizing a fishing expedition the next week, and it seemed to me the last time I used my fishing lines, there were no sinkers on them, so perhaps I could find a bit of lead or iron out in the barn. It was something to do anyway while I waited for those flat irons to heat up. So I left the kitchen, I went out the side door, and I left the screen door unlatched, because that is when I noticed that our pears were ripe, much riper than those on our neighbors' trees just over the fence. So I gathered up a few of those pears. They were still cool from the night air. And I took the pears with me into the barn, and I climbed up to the loft. I remember those pears were so sweet. After how sick we had all been from the sick fish that week and the mutton stew we had been eating, I did not even want to think of eating meat. So I ate one pear, then I ate another. I straightened the curtains on the window of the loft, and then I just lingered there. For no particular reason, just finishing the pear. Then I went and I rummaged in the workbench looking for something for sinkers. And that is when I heard it. It was a scraping or a groaning sort of a noise. By the time I climbed down from the loft and crossed the yard, the screen door was wide open. I went inside the house and I opened up the door to the sitting room. The main thing that I remember was the blood. There was so much of it. It soaked Father's overcoat under his head. It was dripping from the sofa kitchens onto the flowered carpet. It was sprayed across the wallpaper and the pictures hanging on the wall. All I remember is that I was so horrified and frightened, I backed up out of the room and I ran to the back stairs so I could call upstairs to Maggie. She had gone upstairs to take a short nap before starting lunch. "Maggie, come down quick." She called down quite calmly. "What's the matter then?" "Maggie, something has happened to Father." Maggie came pounding down 3 flights of stairs, and she started to enter the sitting room. No, Maggie, do not go in there. "Oh, Maggie, I must have a doctor. Go and see if Dr. Bowen is home. Go quickly." So I watched Maggie as she ran across the street and rang violently at Dr. Bowen's door. Then she came running back. Dr. Bowen was out on house calls. "Maggie, I cannot be alone here. Go and see if Alice Russell can come over. Go quickly." So Maggie went rushing off again and left me standing there by the side door alone. I hoped. I remembered that Father had locked those 3 locks on our front door when he came in. No one could have gotten in the house that way. And no one inside the house could have gotten out that way. I must have looked terribly distressed because I suddenly heard a noise from my next door neighbor's house. It was my neighbor, the widow, Mrs. Churchill. "Lizzie, what is the matter?" she called. "Oh, Mrs. Churchill, do come over. Someone has killed Father. I do not know, but he must have had an enemy, for we have all been sick, and Mrs. Borden thinks the milk has been poisoned." She offered to go and see if someone could call someone for help. "Yes, please go." So she went running across the street to the stable that was just down the road from us, where they had a telephone to call for help, leaving me alone by the side door once again. Until finally Dr. Bowen returned and came over. I pointed him towards the sitting room door. He told me later that nothing in his 25 years' experience as a physician prepared him for what he saw there. Father was lying on the couch on his right side, the left side of his face smashed in, a mangled pulp of bloody flesh and chipped bone. He picked up one of Father's hands, still warm, no pulse, but warm. I reeled. Someone got me a chair and brought me a cold compress for my head and a fan. I do wish that someone would find Mrs. Borden. She had a note and she went out. She must have returned, but I have not seen her. I wish someone would find her. And Dr. Bowen, would you please send a telegram to my sister? She is visiting friends in Fairhaven, but word it carefully. There is an old lady where she is staying who is feeble, and she had better not have the shock. I do wish that someone would find Mrs. Borden. Finally, Mrs. Churchill and Maggie agreed they would go upstairs and look for Mrs. Borden. Clutching hands together tightly, they crossed through our dining room, scurried across a corner of the sitting room where Father's body still lay. They crossed the front hallway and went up the front staircase. They could not have been more than halfway up those stairs when we heard a blood-curdling scream. Mrs. Churchill came running back, doubled over in fright. "Is it another one?" Dr. Bowen asked. Yes. They had discovered the body of Mrs. Borden lying face down on the carpet in the guest bedroom in a large pool of blood. Dr. Borden went up and discovered that her head had been smashed in as well, and she probably had been dead for an hour, maybe even 2 of them. I could barely stand it. Someone led me into the dining room where there was another small sort of sofa where I could lie down, because soon the police were swarming everywhere, demanding answers to questions. Did you see anything? Is anything missing? Do any Portuguese work for your father? Is there anyone at all you might suspect? No, there is no one. I did not see anyone. Nothing seems to be missing. Please, this is too much for me. It is too much for me. I need to go upstairs and lie down. Thank goodness for Alice Russell and my friend Reverend Buck. They led me upstairs, and I spent most of the afternoon that day just staring out the window and let them fuss over me like I was an invalid. Dr. Bowen came with a preparation of bromocaffeine to blunt the pain and calm the nerves. And still the police kept coming with another question and another and another. Where were you? They wanted to know. For how long? Who else was in the house? Could your uncle or your servant have done anything? I tried to answer every question they put to me as calmly and as correctly as I possibly could. But I was in a state of great distress. No, she was not my mother. She was my stepmother. My own mother is dead. No, I did not say I was in the barn for 30 minutes. It was 20 minutes to half an hour. I said 20 minutes to half an hour, sir. No, not all of my answers were consistent. But I had seen so many men and had been questioned about so many things that afternoon. My head was in a whirl. Here is what they noticed. I was quite calm. There were no hysterics. I was not weeping uncontrollably. I was not raging at demands that the murderer be killed. Well, I never have been prone to hysterics. But what they noticed gave birth in their minds to something indescribable. Right there, right then, I became the primary suspect. Well, the next day, I was so weak, I did not even have the strength to leave my bedroom. My nerves were completely shattered. Dr. Bowen had to come 3 times. Bromocaffeine was no longer working. He mercifully administered morphine. Everyone in Fall River was worked up to a fever pitch. The headlines were blaring out with horrible words. Butchery, hacked to pieces in their own home, mutilated beyond recognition. There were crowds outside our house all day, that Thursday, and the Friday afterwards, and Saturday, the day of the funerals, watching me, examining how I looked, what I wore. For the funeral, I wore a simple black dress. But no, they said, Lizzie Borden is not in proper mourning. No crepe, no black veil. May I please note, Mrs. John Sherwood very clearly says that the black veil is very injurious. It harms the eyes and injures the skin. I was trembling so badly. On the day of the funerals, I had to lean on the undertaker's arm just to make it from the house to the carriage for the ride to the cemetery. All along the route, hundreds and hundreds of people, all of them staring at us, watching us, some of them raising their hats, paying Father their last respects. But how many of them in that crowd and gathered around the granite archway at Oak Grove Cemetery had come merely to gawk? We returned home after the cemetery visit to find the police swarming everywhere again. No, I said, it is fine. Please continue. We want as thorough a search as possible. Any lock you cannot open, any door that needs a key, you have only to ask. They searched everything. They went through every room. They searched the attic. They opened every trunk. In our cellar, they dismantled an entire chimney. At about 10 o'clock that evening, there was a knock on our side door. It had already been an exhausting day. First the funeral, then the police searches. Now what? It was the city marshal with the mayor standing next to him, asking if Emma and I would stay in town for the near future. Why? I asked. Is anyone in this house suspected? Well, they hemmed and they hawed. I want to know the truth. I want to know the truth. Well, it pains me to say it, but yes, you are suspected, Miss Lizzy. Very well. I am ready to go whenever you are ready. So several days after that, I was collected, taken to the police station, and subjected to hour after hour of questioning. And only then was I finally arrested. Searched, measured, and booked, led to a cell. Only then did I finally shatter. I cried until I was sick. And only then, exhausted mentally and physically, did I finally fall asleep listening to the sounds of newsboys in the streets, announcing the word of my arrest. So began the long, long process, assembling my legal team, listening to the grand jury deliberations, learning how to behave, what to wear. I dressed very carefully every day of that trial. I always wore black or sober gray or blue. But whether I wore black or sober gray or blue, whether I was wearing silk or velvet or mohair, depended entirely on which of the dozens of newspapers that covered the trial you happened to read. I often wore one of my very favorite pins, with a pansy on it. One newspaper described it as very loud, and another said it was modest. Those who saw me for the very first time when I entered the courtroom, they were astonished. They were expecting a monster, a veritable Medusa. If I had had snakes coming out of my head, I think they would have been delighted. But here I was, average height, common sense shoes. The newspapers had all described me as a girl, but here I was, a full-grown woman. Well, for heaven's sake, I have never lied about my age. I was born in 1860. I was 32 years old on the day of the murders. Hardly a girl. Newspapers typically wrote things like, she is, in truth, a very plain-looking old maid. She could be likened to a typical schoolmarm, plain, practical. There is nothing wicked or criminal or hard in her features. She is, in fact, neither large nor small, nor tall nor short, but is of average build, and in demeanor is quiet, modest, and well-bred. Now, except for my chin, do you think I look jowly? One newspaper described me as jowly, very jowly. The lower part of her countenance is greatly overweighted. Well, apparently everyone had an opinion about my chin, about my face, about me, about the murders. One person wrote to their newspaper saying that Perhaps I had killed them with flat irons rather than an axe. Another suggested I wore a rubber cloak and sponged the blood off. One woman wrote to a newspaper to say that when a person dies, retained on the eye is an image of the last thing that person saw. Now, isn't that fascinating? If I were ever to kill someone, I would come up behind them so quietly and so softly, they would not know I was there. Well, they never looked at my father's eyes. But oh my, they looked at everything I did. They had a judgment on everything they heard about me. One newspaper said, no sudden frantic scream when she discovers her father's body? No rushing to his side? No examination to find a spark of life? And another newspaper said, why did she not run horror-stricken as far from the house as she could, as any normal woman would have? There was no way for me to win. Whether I rushed to the body or away from it, I was unnatural. They said that I never cried. I never went into weeping hysterics. But I never have wept in public. And I was trying in the courtroom to stay calm because I knew it was useless to rage at the injustice of it all. But the eyes that cannot weep are the saddest eyes of all. That's Charles Mackay, the Scottish poet. Oh, my head troubled me so much when I was imprisoned. I was sure they would soon have to take me up the road to the insane asylum. I did not expect to ever be free. I could not see why my friends held such hope. I saw nothing but blackness. There is one thing I do regret. On that Saturday morning, the morning of the funerals, I happened to be going through a trunk and I found an old blue dress with a big paint smear on it. So I brought it downstairs and I showed it to Emma. Look at this old dress, Emma. It is covered in paint. I'm going to burn this old thing up. And Emma said something like, you might as well, or why don't you? And she turned back to the dishes. So I started ripping that dress into pieces and putting them into the stove. Alice Russell was there, and she suddenly cried out, I would not let anyone see me do that, Lizzie. Why not? I said. What could possibly be the matter with that? I finished ripping up the dress, and I put all the pieces in the stove. I'm afraid, Lizzie, said Alice, that was the worst thing you could do. I had forgotten there were policemen stationed outside our house looking in the windows. They were watching everything I did. I knew how it must have looked. Still, that was nothing compared to the day that they brought the skulls in. They had removed the heads from the bodies, removed the flesh, and brought those broken skulls into the courtroom, along with a hatchet found in our cellar. The prosecutor held up the hatchet. Look, he said, it had to have been a hatchet, not an axe. An axe, has a much larger blade. It's what you use to chop down a tree. Takes two hands. A hatchet is much lighter. Only needs one hand. It's what you use to split firewood. See? Less backswing needed. He picked up my father's skull and fitted the hatchet blade into the cuts on the skull. You see, he said, 4 distinct cuts. One of them sliced the cheekbone in two, another went right through the nose, lips, and chin. And then he showed us how the murderer must have been straddling Mrs. Borden or sitting atop her, 4 blows to the backside of Mrs. Borden's right side of her head, 18 blows to the other side. The blood was sufficient to soak the carpet down to its canvas backing. The murderer must have been standing right on top of Mrs. Borden and must have been leaning over my father to do this. Is it physically possible for a woman to do that? Is it morally possible? I did not do this crime. It was the work of a madman or one whose soul is as dark as hell itself. The blows speak for themselves. Each blow distinct and parallel, the work of a strong, skillful hand. Consider this, The murder weapon was never actually identified. Yes, there were hatchets in our cellar, but every house has hatchet. None of ours was ever determined to be the murder weapon. And number 2, there had been strangers seen around our house the week before. The police never found them. Why? Because they had already decided the murder was inside the house. They were not even looking outside the house. And number 3, our house and barn were broken into 3 times in the months leading up to the murder. That alone shows it was possible for someone to get on and off the property undetected. 12 men. 12 men needed less than 2 hours to declare that I was not guilty. To me, these are the best, the handsomest, the noblest of men. All of them upstanding businessmen, all of them married, most of them fathers. They declared me not guilty, no matter what the newspapers or the children outside have to say. Look at me. Watch my behavior. Does it fit how a guilty person would act? Do you believe it is a scientific fact that evil can be seen on a person's face? Well, other than the jowls, it's just impossible. Several weeks after the trial ended, I went back to the First Congregational Church. First time since the murders happened. Dr. Bowen went with me. We went up the side aisle, and I took my place in my usual seat, row number 22. Without a word, everyone seated in the seats around me stood up and moved to a different seat, silently detaching themselves from the evil Miss Borden. It could hardly have been more obvious or more hurtful. Well, I think perhaps no one is coming for tea today. I probably should go and put these tea things away now. But let me leave you with one final thought. I know, if you are like most people, I know you have come to a conclusion already, and it is probably one of only 2 conclusions. Either I am guilty or I am not guilty. With me, there is no in between. But consider this. If I am guilty, then am I not the worst monster you could ever imagine? Because I do not look like a monster. And if I am innocent, is that not even worse? Because if I am innocent, does that not mean everyone is vulnerable? You are vulnerable as well. Well, I would like to thank you all very much for stopping in today and being so kind. Good afternoon. All right. Well, Before I finish up altogether, I am very happy to answer questions. If anyone has questions that perhaps I could answer for you. Feel free. I believe there is a comment section. If you want to go into comments, you are more than welcome to put your comments in there.
And as well, I will note that there's about a 1 minute delay between when you say something and when it goes out.
Oh, yes. Thank you for reminding me. You did tell me. I forgot. Actually, while we're waiting, I'm going to do one thing because I forgot to mention this earlier. Here's what I'm going to do, if you don't mind. I am going to remove my hair because I want to go back to being Leslie Goddard. So I can tell you what this image is behind me. You might have guessed this is not my actual sitting room, but this is an actual image of the sitting room at Maplecroft. That was Lizzie Borden's home after the trial. So it is not the house where the murders actually happened, but it is the house where she lived afterwards for many, many years. And you can see it has been beautifully restored. So if you were curious about where I was, let me answer that. Oh, I see a question. Oh, Mary, thank you. Mary says, do you think Lizzie's sister might have been the guilty party? You know, I think it is a possibility. For those of you who might not be familiar with some of the writing about it or some of the history behind it, a lot of people have written about these murders, and there have been a lot of really fascinating theories about what might have happened. And one of the strongest theories is that perhaps Emma, the sister, came back, killed Mr. and Mrs. Borden, and then left, which is a great alibi, right? She was visiting friends. It was about 30-40 minutes away by train, so she could have come back and then left. And it is absolutely true that in her trial testimony, and Emma always stood by Lizzie through the entire trial. They had a falling out years later, but during the trial, they were very, very close. And Emma actually at one point said, yes, Lizzie did not especially like Mrs. Borden, but I might have disliked her more. So it's a possibility. I think it would have been less likely than some of the other theories, just in the sense that it'd be hard for her to have gotten through Fall River to the Borden house and then left without anyone noticing it. But, you know, it's possible. Some of the other theories, if you're curious, some people have suspected maybe the servant did it. Maggie, she was in the house at the time of the murders. Now, she was washing the windows, so it's not that unlikely she didn't hear, especially Mrs. Borden being murdered. Mrs. Borden probably died between 9 and 9:30 that morning. Mr. Borden somewhere around between 10:45 and 11 a.m. and 11:15. The first phone call to the police came in at about 11:15. Maggie was pretty quickly ruled out, though, because she had no motive. She had nothing to gain from the Bordens dying. She actually stood to lose because she always said she liked the Bordens. They were good to her. She, you know, didn't really want to work for another family because not every family was quite as good to her as they were. So she didn't really have a motive. The uncle actually, I mean, it was kind of bizarre. He showed up the night before for an overnight stay and had no luggage with him, which seems odd. And he had been returning home on a streetcar, and he had this crazy, he had been visiting friends on the other side of town when the murders happened. So they gave him an alibi. But he had this crazy overdone alibi. Like he knew the number of the streetcar he rode home and the number on the conductor's cap on that streetcar, and that there had been 6 priests or something on the streetcar. And then he remembered the name of every single priest. I mean, it was just sort of overdone. But, you know, he also didn't stand to inherit anything from Mr. Borden. Emma and Lizzie were the two most the two who had the biggest motive, who were the ones who stood to gain. There was not a will that Mr. Borden had, but it was, pretty clear it was going to be Lizzie and Emma inherit everything. So, by the way, yeah, Mary, I agree. It does sound prepared, doesn't it? I mean, it's really curious. The $500,000 that Andrew Borden was worth at the time of his murder, that is the equivalent in today's money of something around $12, $13, $14 million in today's money. So this was a really nice fortune. And it is true that Emma and Lizzie both inherited, they each inherited half of it. Some historians have thought it telling that Mrs. Borden died first, because really, when you think about it, there would have been a legal question if Mr. Borden died first. His fortune might have gone in part to his wife, and then when she died, her heirs would have gotten the money. So maybe Mrs. Borden died first. There's no way for us to know that. To this day, this is an unsolved mystery. No one but Lizzie was ever arrested or stood trial for the murders. It is unsolved to this day, which of course means that it's the subject of endless speculation. There's been, if anyone has seen them, there's been a number of television movies and big screen movies. There've been a lot of books. If anyone's curious, and because we're a library, right, I should mention books. There was a great book. If I'm really good, I will have the cover of it. I do. It's right here. There's a great book that just came out in 2019. It is called The Trial of Lizzie Borden. The author's name is Kara Robertson. I think this is one of the best books about the Lizzie Borden case in recent years, because she's looking just at the trial and why exactly was it that the jury found her not guilty they said they were unanimous, the jury was, on their first count, but they hung around for an hour and a half so they wouldn't look too hasty. And yet today, most of the movies just assume she was guilty. There's also a great book called The Borden Murders. This just came out in, was it also 2018? The Borden Murders by Sarah Miller was written for a young adult audience, but actually I think it's great for any age group. Maybe not really young kids, because it's a pretty brutal murder, but it's a really nicely, easy, accessible book and pretty fascinating. So there you go. Bree asks, what draws you to the characters that you chose to portray? Thank you for mentioning that, because if anyone's curious, I do portrayals of about 8 or 9 women, and they vary a lot. So in part, I like to have a diversity of characters. I do Amelia Earhart, I do Eleanor Roosevelt, I do Louisa May Alcott, I do Jackie Kennedy. I mean, it's a pretty wide range. But in addition to being a wide range, the characters I've done so far have all been heroines. If you're thinking, Eleanor Roosevelt, Amelia Earhart, this is the first time I've ever done someone who is considered by some to be a villain, and someone who you can't always trust her, right? I mean, she herself always, she usually didn't talk about the murders, but she was always in what we did hear from her, she was innocent. How much we can trust her on that, we don't know. So, as an actor, that was kind of an interesting challenge, I thought. But I'll also say this. It was partly a result of, there was a festival. There are these festivals, Chautauqua festivals around the country, where they bring together people who do portrayals. And there was a festival coming up in the state of Ohio, the Ashland Chautauqua, wanting to look at heroes and villains. And they wanted villains. And I thought that would be a fun one to propose to them. So that's what led me to propose Lizzie Borden. And she is fascinating. And I love true crime. That's the other thing. If you're a true crime buff. And when you think about it, sorry, this is a long-winded answer, but what's fascinating to me about Lizzie Borden, in a way, is the same thing that people love about true crime today, right? You can't, one thing, you can't always tell by how a person looks and behaves, whether they are guilty or not. Am I right? I mean, I'm thinking about the case of Amanda Knox. Do you remember this woman? She was a student in Italy and her roommate died and everybody thought she was acting unnaturally. She must have been the killer. And then years later, after horrible trials and time in prison, DNA evidence discovered that she was innocent. So you really can't judge it. But we do that all the time, don't we? We kind of judge a person by how they act and behave. And at the time, it was seen as very unnatural that Lizzie was not weeping and acting hysterical the way any normal woman would. It's a human tendency, maybe. Anyway, I find it fascinating. And as Mary points out, no DNA, which is true. There was no DNA evidence at that time. Now, they did have fingerprint technology, but as far as I know, as far as I can remember in my research, there weren't really any fingerprints to test, and fingerprint technology then was really pretty early on, or at least not nearly as sophisticated as today. And also keep in mind, the murder weapon was never identified. They did find 3 hatchets. One of them, in fact, had most of its handle broken off. It just had a stub of wood. Some police investigators thought maybe the murderer broke off the wooden handle because it had blood on it and burned it. So they couldn't even, look for stuff on there. One of the hatchets did have drops of blood and hair on them, but those were tested and they were found to be animal bones and animal hair and animal blood. So even that, but there was no way to test the blood at the crime scene. So it'd be fascinating to know what it was. All right, did we get everything? I'm seeing all the comments here. And looks like we're about at the end of the hour. So maybe it's a good moment to finish up. Let me leave you with one last bit of trivia, if you're curious. Both the house where the murders happened and Maplecroft, the house where she lived afterwards, both of them are still standing. Actually, both of them came up for sale last year. I think they've both been sold. The Lizzie Borden house has the murder house is a bed and breakfast. I think it's run now by a ghost tour company. So if anyone is in Fall River, Massachusetts, which is right near Rhode Island, and you would like to stay in the room where Mrs. Borden was killed, you are more than welcome to take a road trip and check it out for yourself. Other than that, check your local library if you want to read more, right? All right. Thank you, everybody, so much. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Right. Thank you for your time.